So today we're looking at the theory of personality from the perspective of cognitive therapy. So to start with, what is a theory of personality from a psychotherapeutic point of view? I think that's helpful because it's different from psychology. So there are psychological theories of personality like the Myers-Briggs or the Big Five, if any of you heard of those. And that what they try to do is encompass the entirety of someone's personality into traits or types. In psychotherapy, it's a bit different. We're not trying to capture the entirety. We're just trying to look at the specific mechanisms of personality that are at play in causing suffering. So the cognitive theory of personality starts with Albert Ellis, really. In the mid to late 50s, he came up with his rational therapy, which he later ended up calling rational emotive behavior therapy. Kept throwing in more words each decade. And the basic premise, which still sticks with all of cognitive therapy, is this model that contrasts with behavior theory. In behavior theory, you've got stimulus and response. You've got, through whatever conditioning, the outside world has put a stimulus upon us in some way, and the outcome is our emotion, our behavior. Cognitive therapy says, no, before response, that event has to pass through our belief system. We have to interpret events. It's not merely the external reality that causes how we feel or what we do. It's how we interpret that situation. And that is actually the key part of why we suffer, and therefore the key focus of therapy. So from this point of view, we don't have emotional disorders per se, because our emotions are a perfectly logical consequence of our belief systems, of our interpretations. So it's not the emotions themselves that are the problem, but the beliefs and the interpretations that cause them. So for example, 3 people doing the same job all get called into the boss's office. They all get fired. One of them's furious, one of them's full of shame, and one of them's relieved. You can imagine the stories that they must have had to have told themselves to have led to those 3 different emotional reactions, right? The furious one probably sees it as a horrible injustice. The one who's ashamed probably has taken it personally and feels like it's a representation of their worth. And the one who's relieved probably didn't like the job anyway. And this picture highlights that quite nicely. So its mother has clearly looking a bit worried, perhaps a bit anxious. And that anxiety is obviously not the cause of what's actually happening in their external environment, but what's the fantasy or images that are passing through her mind. Albert Ellis called this the ABC model because he calls the external reality the activating event, our interpretations, our beliefs or belief system, and then our emotions or our behaviors that follow as the consequences. Throughout his career, he found that more and more beliefs were getting quite common. So he started making lists of the most common beliefs he sees in some of his clients. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there are a handful I'll show you that will give you a flavor for some of his work. You might find them familiar yourself. So we cannot tolerate certain events, whether it's waiting in line, facing criticism, or being rejected, when in fact we can stand such events, no matter how unpleasant they may be. So if we're telling ourselves something is unbearable or intolerable, then we're going to suffer more than if we're telling ourselves, okay, this isn't nice, but I can get through it. Our worth as persons is determined by our successes and failures or particular traits, such as income, as if the worth of a human could be rated like performance traits. So you can see the parallels there with person-centered theory and conditions of worth. We must maintain the approval of our parents or authority figures as if our existence is dependent on them. You can see how that one can lead to suffering with that sort of external locus of evaluation. You see similar themes in person-centered theory, where the aim is to eventually get to a point where we're evaluating our needs for ourselves rather than what authorities say about us. The world should treat us fairly, as if the world could conform to our wishes. So yes, it would be lovely if the world was fair, but often it isn't. And if we feel like it must be fair and then it's not, that's different from feeling like, well, it would be better if it was fair, but sometimes it doesn't go that way. It's awful or terrible when things do not turn out the way we would like, as if an idea like awful were definable with empirical reference. Terrible and awful, words like that, they're obviously very loaded with emotion and perhaps even morality, but they don't mean an awful lot. It's hard to define them other than saying that this thing's really, really, really bad. So perhaps there's some catastrophizing in that. We would fail to act if we did not think things were awful, or if we were not anxious or angry, as if we need to be emotionally disturbed in order to take rational actions that would make the world a more pleasant place. I actually relate to that one quite a bit. I sometimes feel like, oh, but if I let go of all my anxiety, would I do anything? Like, would I really prepare the same way? And it's kind of a secondary belief, isn't it? There's the belief that causes the anger or anxiety itself, and then there's our belief about how useful that suffering is, even though it causes us pain. So that was a brief view of Albert Ellis. You might have also recognized him from the Gloria tapes, if any of you guys have seen that. If not, please Google Gloria and psychotherapy, and you can see her being treated by Carl Rogers, Fritz Perls, and Albert Ellis consecutively. So Aaron Beck came along a little bit later in the 60s, and he carried the same ABC model, but he looked at our interpretation, our belief systems in a bit more detail. So both of these guys were psychoanalysts, and Aaron Beck was in psychoanalysis. You would have someone lie on the couch and just speak their mind freely, call it free associating. But Aaron Beck found that although people tell narratives and stories about their life, there was this other chain of thoughts going along in the background that weren't often verbalized. I've got an example here. He called these automatic thoughts. So this is from Aaron Beck. A woman who was free associating was talking about a movie she had seen. In describing the plot of the movie, she reported feeling anxious. When I asked her why she was anxious, she said, I guess it's because any scenes dealing with aggression probably stir me up. You can kind of hear this is a logical or rational analysis already. This guess was prompted by her notion, derived from psychoanalytic theory, that aggression produces anxiety. When I then inquired whether she had been having another chain of thoughts just prior to noticing the anxiety, she responded, now I've got it. I had the thought that you were critical of me for wasting my time by going to the movies. That's why I feel nervous. So just in this sort of, just out of consciousness was this, I guess, the truth of her anxiety, which you can always see with that eureka moment. It fits, it resonates. It's not just a rational explanation. It's something that feels right. It's like, yep, that was what it was. I kind of had this thought in the back of my head that you were judging me. You know, you're a big time doctor, and I've just been telling you about spending my time going to the movies. Maybe you would judge me. So he found that these type of automatic thoughts would often go missing in people's free associating. So he started asking people about them more specifically. And he described them as specific and discrete. So it's usually a particular, in a dialogue we're having in our head, it's like an actual conversation. Or it could, if they're images, it's like a specific image. You know, maybe I'm mentally rehearsing something that's about to happen later, some phone call I'm going to have or something. Or if it's a memory, you're going through the specific memory, frame by frame. It's reflexive, so it's not the type of thinking you have when trying to problem solve or think something through, or, you know, what do I need to get from the supermarket later? It just happens to you. It's autonomous. They're difficult to turn off. Preconscious, that's a psychoanalytic term, a Freudian term. It means it's not repressed, it's not unconscious, but it's not in your awareness. But you can have access to it. It's just on the cusp. So, for example, if I asked you all now to notice the sensations in your right hand, you could probably do it quite quickly, although a few seconds ago, your attention wouldn't have been there. So it's pre-conscious. In the same way, we can guide our clients to notice their automatic thoughts. We tend to accept their validity without question. He noticed that they're idiosyncratic to individuals, but he also noticed that people with the same diagnosis seem to have similar thoughts. So, for example, people who are anxious seem to worry about the future, whereas people who are depressed seem to have thoughts that things are already awful and will continue to be awful indefinitely. So had more hopeless thoughts than what if thoughts. And he noticed that these were often distorted, meaning they weren't perhaps logical or weren't rational based on the evidence they were getting from reality. And he often found that they were self-instructions. I should do this, I have to do that. Self-punishments or rewards, or evaluations of ourselves or other people. So you see, we're starting to expand this model out a bit now. Within this belief system bits are automatic thoughts. So you can ask the question, well, where do these thoughts come from? They seem random, they seem autonomous, they seem to pop out of nowhere. And he dug a bit deeper and found that they're often based on this book of rules we carry around with us. He described it like this, that each person seems to have a set of general rules that guide how he reacts to specific situations. These rules not only guide his overt actions, but also form the basis for his specific interpretations, his expectancies, and his self-instructions. Furthermore, rules provide the standards by which he judges the efficacy and appropriateness of his actions and evaluates his worth and attractiveness. He uses rules in order to achieve his goals, to protect himself from physical or psychological injury, and to maintain stable relations with others. And just by the by, Albert Ellis used this term masturbation. He was a very funny guy. He put lots of humor into his therapy. And he also noticed this tendency in thinking that led to suffering, having a lot to do with musts, shoulds, ought tos, have tos, got tos. And it's like, well, where do these rules aren't often, the way rules and assumptions are different from automatic thoughts is we actually say the automatic thoughts in our head. There might be an actual narrative there, like an inner dialogue or the actual images. Whereas rules, you might say them to yourself, but you also can work them out from the way you feel and the automatic thoughts. So they take a little bit more deduction. So let's say I'm driving along and someone cuts me up, and my automatic thought might be, God damn it, idiot, something like that. But the rule underpinning that might be something like, no one should ever do me wrong. No one should ever get in my way. I might not say that to myself, but it's implicit in the feeling I've had. So here's another example of rules. This is also from Aaron Beck. An instructor in a casual way told two students, Miss A and Miss B, who were carrying on a side conversation in his seminar, if you have anything to say, share it with the rest of us or else be quiet. Miss A responded angrily that she had simply been trying to clarify a point. During the open discussion that followed, she challenged the instructor repeatedly regarding the content of his presentation and expressed sharp criticisms of his point of view. Miss B, who was usually an active participant in the seminar discussions, appeared sad and withdrawn following the instructor's comment and remained silent for the rest of the class period. The contrasting responses of these two girls can be understood in terms of different rules they applied in interpreting the situation. Miss A interpreted the teacher's remark as, he is trying to control me, he is treating me like a child. Her emotional response was anger, and the general rule leading to this interpretation was, correction by authority figures means domination and belittling. Her self-instruction was, tell him off. The rule behind her retaliation was, I must get even with people who treat me badly. So she might not be saying that in her mind like she was the automatic thoughts, but it's implicit in her feelings and behavior. Miss B's interpretation was, he has caught me doing something wrong. He will dislike me from now. And her emotions were shame and sadness. So the rule there is correction by authority means exposure and weakness, fault and inferiority. Being corrected means disapproval. Her self-instruction or automatic thought was, I should keep my mouth shut. Her rule is, if I'm quiet, I'm less offensive, and being quiet will show that I'm sorry for my offensive behavior. So those are the rules that underpin the automatic thoughts. Final question might be, well, where do these rules come from? And that's where we get to core beliefs. So our automatic thoughts are very specific to the situation we're in. Our rules and assumptions are a bit broader. They might just pertain to, say, authority figures. But our core beliefs we take everywhere. Our core beliefs are global. They're about ourselves, other people, and the world, not about specific types of situations. So they're core in the sense we take them everywhere. So this is Judith Beck. Judith Beck's Aaron Beck's daughter. They work a lot together and write things together. She defined core beliefs as this. Core beliefs are enduring understandings so fundamental and deep that they often do not articulate them even to themselves. The person regards these ideas as absolute truths, just the way things are. So as an example, E frequently has a concern when he has to engage in a new task, like learning a new skill on the computer, or figuring out how to put together a bookcase, or applying for a bank loan. He seems to have the core belief, I'm incompetent. When the core belief is activated, E interprets situations through the lens of this belief, even though the interpretation may, on a rational basis, be patently invalid. Yes, so I sometimes think of core beliefs like a dormant volcano. They're kind of always there, ready to be triggered, ready to be set off, but it might take a situation to trigger the feelings of them. And once they're activated, they're like this, like Judith describes here, this lens through which we distort reality through. So if core beliefs are the most fundamental level of belief, they're global, rigid, and overgeneralized. Automatic thoughts, on the other hand, are the actual words or images that go through a person's mind. They're situation specific and may be considered the most superficial level of cognition. And the intermediate beliefs, which are our rules and assumptions, exist between the two. So we end up with this model. Now, core beliefs are often used interchangeably with the word schema or schemas. Now, they're very similar, but importantly different. So whereas the core belief might be expressed in like the sentence form, like I am incompetent, or other people are scary and superior, the schema is more like an actual model of either ourself or a bit of our experience. So you can think of it like a map. You might have a map of who you are, and every situation you're in, you look at your map to decide how to navigate it. So there's an example I'll use which is non-psychotherapeutic, but I think will make the point quite well. We all carry in our heads schemas of, let's say, cafes, how they work. But let's say you've only ever been to cafes that have table service. So you know what you do. You walk in, you sit down, waiter or waitress comes over, takes your order, brings you your food, you eat it, you get the bill, you pay, you leave. That's your kind of mental map of how cafes work. Now, let's say you go to a Starbucks for the first time and you go down and sit at a table. Well, what's going to happen? No one's going to come to you because they don't do table service. You might start to get frustrated. You're looking at this situation through your map of how things are or should be. And now reality and your mental map aren't adding up. It won't be until someone makes it clear to you that that's not how it works here that you then change your schema, change your map of the situation, and accommodate for, okay, well, some cafes don't have table service, some cafes you have to order yourself at the till. So now that's a map of a bit of reality. When it's a map about you, it's harder to change because it's so easy to self-fulfill. No matter how long you sit at a table at Starbucks, no one's ever going to come up and take your order. Whereas if you believe you're incompetent, you can start feeling anxious and hopeless and start picturing yourself doing badly. And that can end up actually fulfilling the schema where you actually do end up performing well or avoiding things and doing things incompetently, or at least doing things which you can view through the lens of that schema as incompetence. So whereas our schemas about the world can often be adapted because eventually reality just catches up with us, our schemas of ourselves are much harder to change. So anyway, Judith Beck says, a schema is a hypothesized mental structure that organizes information. Within this schema is E's core belief, I'm incompetent. So a core belief is part of this map, part of the entire schema. When E is presented with negative data, this schema becomes activated, and the data contained in negative rectangles, I'll show you what that means in a second, are immediately processed as confirming his core belief, which makes the belief stronger. So here's, I'm sorry, this is quite small, but here's a representation of a schema. So here's the schema itself, which contains the belief I'm incompetent. And these shapes around the outside are bits of reality, bits of experience. So this top one says difficulty with new computer skills. Okay, well, that nicely fits in the schema, this map, that I'm incompetent. So I'll fit that in. I'll add that to my list of things I'm incompetent for. Difficulty applying for a loan. Okay, well, that means that fits nicely in my schema. I'll take that one on board. Oh, I've been praised by my boss. Well, that doesn't fit. How do I make that fit my incompetence? Oh, okay, well, I didn't deserve the praise. Now that fits in nicely. I chose a healthcare plan. That seems like a competent thing to do. Oh, but it took me a really long time. So that's how I'll make it fit my schema. And then these two down here, paid bills on time, fixed plumbing problem, they don't even register. They just bounce straight off it. So you see, once we've got this map in place, we end up just distorting reality through its lens. And so we end up with this model, where the core beliefs are kind of contained in the schemas themselves. Last concept, I think, is how do we distort information to fit our schemas? Well, there's a handful of cognitive distortions. So Aaron Beck noticed different ways in which we distort information to fit. It would take probably a while to get into any of these in much depth, but I'm not going to do that, but I'll briefly just mention go through them, briefly. So all or nothing, or black and white thinking. Either I'm perfect or I'm a failure. Well, that's not always true, is it? Sometimes you can do things quite well, make a few mistakes along the way, and that's just okay. It's a shade of grey, but we can use black and white thinking to ignore those options. We might overgeneralize by saying always and everything and nothing. My partner never washes up. Well, is that really true? Maybe she does sometimes, but not maybe as much as I want. We overgeneralize to make it fit our narrative. We filter things, which I guess is implicit. We might do that by disqualifying positive attributions. Well, yes, I'm incompetent, but all the competent things I've done, well, they don't really count for whatever reason. We can jump to conclusions by guessing what people are thinking about us with no evidence, by assuming something's going to happen in the future, fortune telling with no evidence. We can make things bigger by magnifying them and make things smaller by minimizing them. So maybe I make one mistake in this presentation and it plagues me all day, whereas I do a handful of other things well and I just don't really, they're not a big deal. Emotional reasoning, that's a really important one. It's when the emotion comes first and then reality follows. So what if I feel guilty? I must have done something wrong. If I'm scared, there must be a real threat. If I'm angry, you must have done something awful to me. So the emotion comes first and we use that as evidence to base our reality on without actually checking if that's true. We can label ourselves. If I call myself stupid, that kind of lets me off the hook for exploring things a bit deeper. well, why didn't I do my work today? Well, I'm lazy and stupid. I guess that explains it then. No more self-awareness to be done. Shoulds and musts, we've already kind of covered that. And personalization, so that's grabbing way too much responsibility than that should be attributed to you, let's say, or not enough. It's like it's everyone else's fault, or it's all my fault. So those are some of the mechanisms in which we can have things distort and fit into our schemas. And that is the model of cognitive theory of personality.